I think it's actually inaccurate to say that he's a heroic or admirable figure. I don't think he would describe himself that way because of the many, many crimes that he committed in his military career. But it's impossible to not admire the guy.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast. Hello, Rob. How's this week been going for you?
Honestly, Rory, it's been kind of awesome.
Oh, that's what I like to hear.
I am a bigger Joe Biden fan than I have ever been.
Okay.
Sorry.
Is that because of recent mugshots?
Well, that's nice, but I think that's more a contrast. The student debt relief thing has been a challenge in the United States. Joe Biden's administration has been trying to lift this incredible burden off of millions of Americans and has been stymied, has been unable to do so. But what happened over the past couple weeks is that for a special class of debtors, the Biden administration was able to give a large matter of debt relief. And the beauty of this is I'm 45, so the friends of mine who are still suffering under college debt are exactly the people that were relieved by this. It's about 800,000 Americans, 800,000 U.S. citizens who have been paying for over 20 years and are in a situation of, income-driven repayment plans, which essentially means that they have to give an amount of money that they can afford, $200 to $400 a month, essentially for the rest of their lives. So
it's more of a graduate tax?
Well, I mean...
if you're paying it for the rest of your life, it's like, well, you've been taxed for graduating?
Yes, exactly. It's a form of debt slavery, frankly. It's debt that you can never, ever get out of. And for this class of 800,000 people, Biden delivered that relief, and that includes some people who are very close to me. And I think that's
so your friends have a bit more cash now and are a bit more happy?
Well, they can finally, in their mid-40s, start their adult lives. They can finally start thinking about maybe I want to start saving up for a house. Maybe I just don't want to be spending as much as a quarter of my monthly income on a bad decision I made 25 years ago. I think it's long overdue. I think the Republicans should have allowed this to go out to a broader group of people. But I think it's amazing. Usually when a broad-based reform is attempted and then it is stopped, people are just out of luck. But I think it's really impressive and a testament to the Biden administration's basic competence that they did manage to carve out protections for the people who were most abused and most vulnerable. And it's just really nice to see something work out like this. And it is a really instructive contrast between just basic competence and actually bringing benefits to U.S. citizens versus Donald Trump and his dumbass mugshot, which is also news from this week.
Would you say the education sector in America is a racket?
I think that's absolutely fair, Rory, and that is a great segue.
Any other rackets in America you're aware of?
Well, Rory, war. War is a racket, as we can hear from General Smedley Butler, who will be the figure that we will use to more or less frame today's episode. What I've got in mind for the next two episodes is sort of discussion of early American empire, early U.S. empire, and the phases that it went through. And I want to do that using, to some extent, the biographies or careers of three fellows. The first is I think one of the most decorated Marine Corps generals in history, Smedley Butler, who will focus on
Two Medals of Honor.
Two Medals of Honor. I think anybody. I think there's maybe one other Marine who had done that.
I think there might be some. Oh yeah, you mean for Marines? I think very early on they were handing them out quite liberally, and he tried to return his.
I got that from some of my reading on him. Yeah, that he had very firm ideas about what was and was not worthy of a Medal of Honor, but he's got a couple of them. So the first, today's episode will be focused on Smedley Butler and the U.S. empire that he got to experience, and then contrasting it next episode with two more famous figures, Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who were two presidents that sort of formulated the modern U.S. world empire. Wilson largely seen as a failure, and Roosevelt, I believe, more and more to be seen as a success. But that's for next episode. This episode is about Smedley Butler.
So Smedley Butler is an incredibly interesting man. I seen a YouTuber, is it Knowing Better, described him as the Forrest Gump of the real world, of the early
fair.
19th century. It seems to be every important American decision being made, Smedley Butler is in there.
And he did what's extraordinary about it, Rory, is that he continued it after his career. Smedley Butler's retirement is a extraordinarily important aspect of who he is and who we know him to be.
And we'll find out why the posh people of Philadelphia despised him.
That too was an interesting aspect. So Smedley Butler was born in 1881. And his Forrest Gump-like career, as you describe it, began in the Spanish-American War. If you're quick on the spot with the math, you might have noticed that he was 17 when the Spanish-American War broke out. This is a guy who was so war-happy, so gung-ho to prove himself as a soldier that he managed to get himself into the military at the age of 17. One interesting thing about Butler is that he was, and is partially why he was able to become as distinctive a figure as he is today, is that he was definitely a very serious son of privilege. He was born wealthy in Pennsylvania, and his father was a congressman throughout much of his military career. So he was able to both have more incredible exploits, but also have more fantastic flameouts than any other military figure, because his dad was a congressman. And then when his dad finally died, Butler's career didn't last for very much longer after that. So it is important to understand that Smedley Butler was a bit of a Nepo baby, as they say on TikTok nowadays. And
he's from a Quaker family, which earned him the name the Fighting Quaker.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. He grew up. Yeah, I don't know enough about Pennsylvania and Philadelphia more generally, but it is just fascinating dynamic how that state has developed over time. And in the early 20th century, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania were a much bigger factor in U.S. politics than they are today. And that, too, played into Smedley Butler's role. So what's so great about Smedley Butler, and that makes him such a phenomenal figure to look at early American empire with, is that his fighting career really started with the launching gun of U.S. imperialism. That would be the Spanish-American War. Prior to 1898, the United States government was mostly preoccupied with taking the continental United States. That was what most of the U.S. military forces were doing, was sort of corralling, occasionally massacring Native American populations in the continental United States. In the early 1890s, quite famously and talked about at the time, the continental U.S. frontier was seen as being closed. And it really only took half a decade after that for a country that had, for over a century at that point, prided itself on not much foreign intervention, to decide that actually let's just take everything that's left of the Spanish Empire in mostly a war of aggression. And Smedley Butler was there at the outset, and he was there for what is in many ways, we had less power during this period that Smedley Butler was active. He joined in 1898, or was it 1897, and then retired in 1931. But this early period, perhaps in part because we weren't as powerful as we were to become after 1917, and then again after 1945, we were a lot more brutal. Just really, really awful. And Smedley Butler's a really interesting figure because he still has some pop cultural imprint. He was played by Robert De Niro in a recent film. Unfortunately, it was a flop. I thought it was actually a fun film, but it was Amsterdam with Margot Robbie and
Okay, I heard
Christian
complaints
Bale.
of whitewashing and stuff in it, but I haven't seen it, unfortunately.
It was, I think I think the director, was it David O. Russell or is it someone else, is apparently an awful person. So people were kind of celebrating.
Okay, his failure.
Yeah, more revelations were coming out about that, but he's made some really great films. And Amsterdam was not a really great film, but it was a fascinating film because it's all about the environment of the United States in the 1930s, where Smedley Butler went from becoming a well-regarded Marine into the historical figure that he is today. And yeah, Robert De Niro plays Smedley Butler. Unfortunately, he's not described as such, but I'm reading this book, regrettably have not finished yet, Gangsters of Capitalism, which is both a biography of Smedley Butler and a story of U.S. empire in that era. And honestly, scenes from this are lifted directly into the film Amsterdam with Robert De Niro playing. So anyway, Smedley Butler still has a pop cultural imprint, in part because of this book he wrote, War is a Racket. Empire, the work that he did, the empire that he built, the savagery that he carried out and that the United States carried out is largely forgotten. We just don't want to think about it. Because largely, even the way that U.S. empire functions today, it's not something that we engage in so much. We're not just straight up invading multiple places, knocking over their governments. We do that occasionally, and it backfires terribly.
Is it possible that America doesn't need to anymore because of what was implemented here?
Absolutely, I think that's absolutely the case. Well, I think because what has been implemented by Wilson, by Roosevelt on a much larger scale, I think one of the reasons that we don't talk about what was done in Smedley Butler's time in the military from 1898 to 1931 is because so much of it was a ruinous failure. All that violence, all that horror that we committed, million people we killed in the Philippines, all of that amounted to essentially nothing.
Because during the Filipino-American War, it's often considered, this is when America isn't expansionist, but it's doing horrendous things there.
Oh yeah, no, it's very expansionist. One of the most famous racist poems is "The White Man's Burden" by Rudyard Kipling.
I've seen the illustrations and stuff as well.
Yeah, which is basically Kipling saying, you're here to civilize the benighted brown races, this, that, and the other thing, and that's the white man's burden. And it was actually written on the occasion of the United States taking over the Philippines.
But wasn't there, weirdly, racism prevented America taking over more territory because there was a fear of all these other races in the Congress?
There's a real duality there. And that's exactly the reason I'm doing these early empire podcast right now is this is what I'm covering in the book that I'm writing, American Empire, the First 100 Years, and I'm wrestling with that right now because it is fascinating.
They were so racist they wouldn't invade. It's a bizarre, double entendre.
Oh no!
Uh-oh.
There was no point. There was no point at which we would not invade. But what was established very early on in Supreme Court cases. I think one for each territory. They're called the Insular Cases. A series of opinions by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1901 about the status of U.S. territories acquired in the Spanish-American War. And this is a very important distinction that I think goes with some other distinctions between the territory that was taken on the U.S. continent and the territory that was taken after 1898. And that distinction has continued. It's basically saying, yes, we can take territory. We held the Philippines more or less between 1898 and 1946 as a brutal, straightforwardly imperialist colonialist possession. That was ours. That was American soil. However, none of the people outside of the continental United States got the benefit of the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights. That's what the Insular Cases in 1901 and from 1901 established. That that exception governs really everything outside of the continental United States. I suppose not Hawaii. Hawaii did eventually become a full state, and that is that the people of Hawaii regard, well, by law, I think always, and in practice, probably over the past 50 years, all the people in Hawaii can benefit from full rights as American citizens. Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, these were the primary acquisitions of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Those people were different. The Supreme Court said so. And I think actually used language saying, well, they're not of the Anglo-Saxon races or something along those lines. So that vicious racism did have a positive effect, though, because a lot of the opposition...
That'll be taken out of context.
I hope not. Because a lot of the opposition to straightforwardly annexing the Philippines came from that racism. If it weren't for the bigotry of a lot of the U.S. populace, there would, we might have U.S. states, the Philippines might be divvied up into U.S. states by this point. But it was actually, there were virulent racists who were against intervention in the Philippines because they did not want to add, at that point, it was just 7 million Filipinos to the U.S. As U.S. citizens. Now, of course, there are 110 million Filipinos, and it would have been a very different picture had we decided to treat those regions that we taken in the Spanish-American War as we had treated Idaho or New Mexico or the U.S. states. So I think there's sort of 4 phases of empire that I want to talk about today and the next one. There's the initial acquisition of the U.S. continent, which was, in a horrific way, was actually very democratic. And this is, I think, a key distinction between what was going on in the 19th century and what was going on in the 20th century. And really, more or less, the Spanish-American War was in 1898, so you can almost do a direct a dividing line there. And this is something that I grapple with a lot as I've been reading a number of books about what we did to the Native Americans. What is different and starts in the 20th century, and Smedley Butler is one of the first and most cogent illustrators of, is the fact that war is a racket. It benefits nobody. U.S. empire benefits a very small elite of the U.S. public. I guess at this point, 10%, 20% of the U.S. public are large-scale stockholders. And so to some extent, perhaps it may benefit as much as 20% of the U.S. public. But by and large, the real beneficiaries of war are elites, capitalists, profiteers, this, that, and the other thing. This first phase of U.S. empire in the 19th century, that wasn't the case. For sure, there were large-scale land speculators. For sure, a lot of the biggest beneficiaries were horrific slave drivers, this, that, and the other thing. But U.S. empire, U.S. taking of the American continent, with all its savagery, with all its horror, was popular and for the benefit of the majority of white men in the United States, because there was the potential that those white men in the United States could get a chunk of land. So in that sense, the first American empire was kind of democratic. And honestly,
it was horrific, but it benefited more of the populace.
Yes, and it's actually a good thing that U.S. empire now is less democratic, because if today's American empire provided as broad based a set of benefits to Americans, then what we're doing right now would have no point. Like there'd just be no point in arguing against it, because it would be. There were heroic people in the 19th century who did argue against what the United States was doing. Abraham Lincoln, I think lost his initial seat in Congress a decade or so before he was president, because he was opposing the Mexican-American War, which was U.S. conquest of Mexican territory in the 1840s. There were people who were heroic enough to argue against it, but to very little effect. And if the U.S. empire did as much for the average U.S. citizen as U.S. empire did in the 19th century, then there'd be no stopping it. But the truth is, today, it's and even more so than it was in Smedley Butler's. Smedley Butler's day, at least there were manufacturing jobs to be had for this. Nowadays, it's a few It's a few thousand engineers and executives that benefit from the $500 billion. The U.S. defense budget is, I think, closing in on is most of $1 trillion a year. Half of that goes to a few thousand executives and engineers that work for our defense companies. So that's $500 billion a year. So that first phase was very democratic. And then we get into this sort of proto phase that actually lasted rather a long time. I think you could say really Smedley Butler's entire career from, I would say, probably from 1898, the Spanish-American War, all the way until the advent of FDR's good neighbor policy in the early 1930s. And this was basically, and it's actually not a big focus of my book. I do need to write a few paragraphs on it because it wasn't the U.S. global empire that Woodrow Wilson failed to build and FDR succeeded in building. It wasn't the U.S. world system. It was just kind of a crappy, gross little wannabe European empire. This period from 1898 to 1933, you didn't have the IMF. You didn't have U.S. dollar hegemony. You basically just had a bunch of very, they fought and died for this, very brutally fought for and suffered for, but pretty gross European-style empire of genocide and massacre.
Banana Wars reminds me a lot of just like classic raping and pillaging.
Yeah,
it did seem like they would just pop down like Vikings with superior technology, destroy everything, and say, "No, you'll play along with our corporations."
Yep, and it's disgusting. It's not on the same scale. We only killed 1 million Filipinos, not 10 million like the Belgians did in the Congo, but it's very much the same style of gross little crappy Me Too. It's Me Too empire. It's basically a whole bunch of crappy little follower loser countries looking at the British Empire being like, we want that too, so we're going to go out and do some genocide. And it's really gross to look at Smedley Butler's career, and Smedley Butler was pretty gosh darn disgusted by it.
Oh yeah, he did some horrific things.
And just realized that like all that, because I think we and even myself, I think we like to sort of huff and puff about the scramble for Africa in the United States and be like, that's so vile. We weren't involved in that sort of thing. We were too busy doing it to Latin America. We were very much. There's the Monroe Doctrine, which was kind of farcical. This idea, starting from the 1820s, that the United States says nobody can intervene in the Americas other than us. But that wasn't really true. If the British wanted something in Latin America through the end of the 19th century, and the U.S. opposed it, well, too bad for the U.S. It's only it's called the Roosevelt Corollary. Not Franklin Delano Roosevelt, but his cousin Teddy Roosevelt, who's a very different figure, who was president at the beginning of the 20th century rather than from 1933 to 1945.
Was he the one that was a bit underwhelming and quite often would do stuff he didn't like?
Teddy Roosevelt is looked upon very positively by a lot of folks.
He's his cousin.
What's that?
His relative that got in power you were talking about?
No, Teddy Roosevelt Teddy Roosevelt was the first Roosevelt, and then Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the epically important Roosevelt that we'll be talking about next episode. But Teddy Roosevelt is still well regarded. They're still writing very long biographies about him. He's a weird figure because he was a progressive Republican, I believe. Both political parties had progressive wings back in that era. We can't fall too far down that rabbit hole, but just know that political parties were different things than what they are today. Roosevelt was both very interested in progressive things like fighting against big business. He's seen as sort of the founder of the environmental movement in the United States, conservation. But his real legacy and why I dislike Roosevelt is the arch-imperialist. He's one of the first guys who was like, yeah, let's go be one of these lame little European empires. And that was Teddy Roosevelt's deal. Speak softly and carry a big stick is one of his maxims. He didn't really speak very softly. So that's Teddy Roosevelt. And he was eager to get involved everywhere. The Panama Canal, that was his sort of instinct. It's fascinating. I mean, we are aware of this history vaguely in the United States, but we don't think about it much because it's really gross. And it's really comprehensive. And just looking at, I think probably this would be a good time to read this incredible quote from Smedley Butler. It's not actually in the book, War is a Racket. It's in an interview that he gave to a magazine called Common Sense in 1935. But it ended up providing the title of Katz's book, and it's seen as one of the most evocative things that Smedley Butler said. So Smedley Butler says in this 1935 interview, "I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the International Banking House of Brown Brothers from 1902 to 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hits. The best he could do was to operate his racket in free districts. I operated on free continents." It's stunning to see someone of this stature express just how awful those years were and how devoid of real merit. And it was just a gross little European empire. And we'll talk about how that shifted with Woodrow Wilson and FDR. Those really sort of two other phases. You had with Woodrow Wilson, you had the speaking in a more high-minded way, making all kinds of really great claims about what the U.S. was going to do, how we were going to be better, how we were going to respect peoples, how we were going to respect self-determination, while backing up essentially none of it. And then finally with FDR, you do have some real movement towards a better way of interacting with the world. Of course, that movement towards a better way of interacting with the world is also an artifact of the United States becoming so much more powerful in other ways, the way you were referring to earlier, that made it unnecessary for us to be such bloodthirsty savages as we were in Smedley Butler's time. But I think that's the progression I want to talk about in this episode and the next episode.
But there's also things like he's one of the most decorated American soldiers, but this is also the time that soldiers used to get paid quite a lot, and if they done certain actions, they got like a percentage of it. And then this is around the time where they figure out that soldiers much prefer honor and medals, so you can pay them a lot less if you give them medals. So it's possible one of the reasons he has so many is they're still recalibrating. It's like, yeah, just give them loads of stuff. So we see that the people actually doing the war get paid less while the profiteers massively increase.
Yeah, I think that's a point he makes in his tract, the War is a Racket. I think at that point they were still allowed to do a fair amount of looting. There's certainly some, but I think even by the end of his career, that was less of a factor. And I don't think the actual participation in spoils, even at the beginning of his career, wasn't as much of an aspect of what was going on there. But yes, he's right. He points out in War is a Racket, if you just convince everybody it's about honor, then the government and the elites can profit more. That's a very good point. What's fascinating, so I have a fair amount of friends who ended up as Marines, and what was interesting was I had a conversation with one of them about Smedley Butler. So like, of course, I know everything about Smedley Butler. He's one of the most decorated Marines ever.
And he has a massive Marines tattoo on his chest, I believe.
Yes, he did.
Got infected when he was in the war in the Philippines, so he spent most of it just sort of in the sick bay drinking, apparently.
Yeah. So he was, he fell out of love, Smedley Butler, with the reasons why his wars were being fought, but he remained in love with the Marine Corps, and the Marine Corps appreciates that to this day. So part of my friend's education as a Marine was learning about the exploits of Smedley Butler, the things that he had done, because Smedley Butler, child of privilege that he was, did the things. He fought in many battles, was wounded in China, was wounded, and I believe in other places as well. And then I was like, oh, well, so you know about the book he wrote, War is a Racket, and his famous retirement as one of the most prominent anti-war activists in U.S. history. He was like, what? Like, he had absolutely no idea. No. I mean, there are Marine bases named after Smedley Butler. And his exploits are, part of the basic training of every Marine to this day. And I think that's actually kind of interesting, because if the Marines truly wanted to suppress his influence or the ideas that he is so famous for putting forward outside of the Marine Corps, then they could have just dropped him down the memory hole. I mean, there's plenty of other decorated and impressive Marines, but I do think it's to the credit of generations of folks in charge of the Marine Corps that they've provided this incredibly cynical Easter egg to any Marine who cares to do a little more research.
Okay, interesting.
And, I think that, but I do think I think that's fascinating. So I just quickly, this is by no means an incomplete list, but just to give an indication of what Smedley Butler's world was. The United States invaded, killed 1 million people in the invasion of the Philippines, and occupied it from 1898 to 1946. In Nicaragua, I believe there were U.S. military forces there, I believe, before 1912. But it was full-on U.S. military occupation between 1912 and 1933. The Dominican Republic, 1916 to 1924. U.S. occupation. Haiti, 1915 to 1934. U.S. occupation. I mean, the United States had a large territorial empire, essentially, during this period that was maintained with great savagery, This book, Gangsters of Capitalism, makes for some really rough reading about what was going on in the Philippines. It was stuff that we associate with the Nazis. Some U.S. soldiers get killed, so the U.S. doesn't just wipe out that town. They do their best to wipe out everybody.
I heard they did a thing which was like the opposite of a concentration camp. It was essentially anyone in here is safe, but if you're outside, you're fair game. So yes, they would just murder entire villages because it was like, well, you weren't in our little special prison camp.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the definitions of concentration camp. But yeah, so there's just this particular incident where I think a couple dozen U.S. soldiers were killed by a village that they were in the process of brutalizing. So in return, the United States didn't just wipe out the village. They worked very hard to wipe out the entire island of hundreds of thousands of people in the Philippines.
Rob keeps quoting a figure of 1 million dead Filipinos. It's worth noting that this is one of the larger estimates. A more broadly accepted figure is that the US killed a mere 250,000 Filipinos in its conquest. We at the More Freedom Foundation think it's important to get the number right, but don't think the lower number makes US actions any more virtuous.
It's really just horrific stuff. Absolutely horrific stuff. And this was a country that was telling itself that it got into this war to help people. And this
didn't
was
the counts get out, and then the American population was horrified?
Some of us were,
okay,
but not enough. We stayed. We stayed there until 1946, until the comparison with the Japanese was just too strong. I think it was one part of it. Racism was part of it as well. The fact that the U.S. public would never accept any kind of equality for the Philippine public, and was happier to just be shot of it. But also just the whole World War II dynamic, and look at how heroically the Filipinos fought off the Japanese, and now we're going to come in and do what we did in 1898 again, and it just wasn't that appealing, and didn't fit with the new, more powerful United States and its self-image under Roosevelt. So we did let the Philippines go. We let a lot of these occupations go: Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, Haiti. In that passage I read, Butler mentions action in Honduras, in other places as well. I mean, we just went around murdering people who disagreed with U.S. business interests. It was very, very straightforward and very, very gross. What made Smedley Butler, I think, immortal was what he did with
his duckboards.
His duckboards. What was that?
In World War I, he was in the rear with the gear. He was a bit upset, but very well in military. There's the teeth and the tail, so he was in charge of the logistics and a very important part. So he was given one of these hospitals and supply depots, and a common thing that was happening was it was getting it to be a complete mud fest. So he was using access boards that weren't needed for the trenches, and essentially utilizing that, and it made things significantly better. So he got quite decorated for that. That's one of his achievements.
Yeah, well, an interesting aspect of his career is, despite how successful he was militarily, despite how even by 1917, 1918, he was already seen as somewhat unreliable so he was not given the combat command that he wanted in World War I. So he's got this incredibly storied career, probably one of the most experienced fighting generals in U.S. history, and he is not given the combat command he desperately wants in World War I. I mean, in part perhaps because he had demonstrated that he cared too much about his soldiers, and caring about your soldiers was not a way to be a good leader in World War I. And he was kept in the rear, where he did a commendable job. What's one thing that I found kind of fascinating, and is just a reminder of the century of humiliation or what have you, is that he managed to be fighting in, or at least administrating in, China not once but twice. At very different times in China's history, at very different times in his career. I believe he sort of finished out his career as some form of administrator looking after U.S. interests in China in the late 1920s. He started out his career and was wounded for the first time in a multinational conquest of China in the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion.
An 8-nation army, was it?
Yes, the 8-nation army. And it is fascinating, because that was a real symbol of the United States really just trying desperately to be an empire like any other. I mean, that one, I'm almost a little more sympathetic to that than I am to the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, what we did in Cuba, what we did in Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, etc. I'm more sympathetic to that because it was sort of, well, if we're going to have everybody's got a hand in this, and if we're not fighting on the ground, then we're going to lose out in the benefits of this after the fact. But yeah, the Boxer Rebellion, so 1899, 1900 or so, the incredibly immiserated Chinese public rose up, and unlike the last number of times that the incredibly immiserated Chinese public rose up, the Chinese government said, well, hey, actually, maybe this is a good opportunity to try and get rid of some foreigners, and banded together with them. So you had a rebel army combined with the small kernel of the Chinese army that had done some modernization, and it was a fairly strong fight. I don't think the outcome was ever in doubt, but I think I just read this. Smedley Butler himself was shot twice, and there are a lot.
Wounded in action.
Yeah, and there are a lot of very serious, very pitched battles, but it is just interesting to...
But one odd thing is, the reason it's called the Boxer Rebellion is the rebels didn't really have weapons, so they were using martial arts. And since Europe didn't really have a tradition, the only martial art they know is boxing. So that's why it's called the Boxer Rebellion. So it's like you're fighting against rebels that don't really have weapons when you do.
Well, that's true of some of the peasant rebels, but they were also fighting the regular Chinese military that very much had weapons. And if you've got, obviously, if you're just going to be cutting through a bunch of peasants who believe they're immune to bullets and want to box with you, you're going to win. But that fervor was combined with some real military forces on the Chinese side as well. I think it's worth thinking about that a lot. Like when people talk about the Cold War, we never talk about the fact that the United States invaded the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And when you talk about U.S.-Russian, U.S.-Chinese antagonism, I don't feel like enough attention is paid to our participation in the, what'd you call it? It was the eight-nation army or something along those lines?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we conquered the country. It was the British who initially conquered the country in 1861.
That's very surprising.
Yes, shocking, right? But it was, the United States was very much part of that multinational police action that really had no purpose other than to, we were going to protect missionaries or such like hogwash. It was an attempt to crush China and secure the benefits of her markets for ourselves. And I think that the origin stories of these conflicts with China and Russia should pay a little more attention to the fact that we invaded both of these countries quite brutally. In 1861, I think I can't recall if the British took Beijing or not, but I think they generally contented themselves with burning a summer palace, this, that, and the other thing. In the aftermath of the Boxer Rebellion, Beijing, I believe, was sacked with fairly large-scale massacres. It was... It's just something we don't talk about so much for a lot of pretty obvious reasons, embarrassment being one of them. But I think his career is very, very worth studying. I would highly recommend this book, Gangsters of Capitalism. It's Jonathan Katz does a great job actually going to all of these places. And what he illustrates here, and this is one of the greatest condemnations of the U.S.'s brutal empire in this period, is that so many of these places are still suffering the consequences of what we did there. And, of course, nasty things that we did later as well. I mean, Nicaragua we occupied for 2 decades. It is not a happy place today. The Dominican Republic is actually in significantly better shape. I hear good things about the DR. Or rather, I don't have to... I've never really felt the need to investigate the DR in great length because it's actually pretty, reasonably happy. Haiti, we occupied for 20 years, remains a nightmare, and we've done nasty things since. So Butler's critique, he finishes he ends his career in 1931. He was apparently considered for the role of Commandant of the Marine Corps. I'm not sure if I pronounced that appropriately, which is extremely prestigious and is, of course, what every Marine wants to end their career doing. He was passed over for that in part because his father, his great protector in the House of Representatives, had died, and also because apparently he had talked a lot of crap about Mussolini.
Yes, there was a reporter had said that Mussolini's, I don't think he was personally driving it, but it was like his motorcade had knocked down a child, and Mussolini replied that, what's one child to, a nation? This is nothing. So it was rumored, and he basically says, oh yeah, this is fact. And then they were trying to stay out of World War II, trying to be fairly, well, I don't think it happened at this stage, but trying to be fairly neutral. And then he got massively criticized for this when in reality it turned out this was true.
Yeah. So he, Smedley Butler, was passed over to be the commander of the Marine Corps because he was an anti-fascist, which does not hurt his historical standing one little bit.
Yes, it's aged well.
Yes, that was a good choice.
Well, sadly, there was quite a lot of fascist sympathy in America at the time. We go into something later on, but there's a lot of big corporations think a lot of these ideas are not the worst.
Mussolini in particular, and so Mussolini, it's important to remember, was around for 2 decades. I think he took power in Italy in the early 1920s. And I think what's the beer hall putsch? Didn't Hitler try to follow his lead in the 1920s at some point and ended up in jail for a number of years? The extreme awfulness of the Nazi regime was no bar to many Americans liking what he was about. But I think Hitler came to power in 1933. By like 1936, you have Kristallnacht, and it's just clear that he's virulently anti-Semitic, which again wasn't a problem for a lot of people in the United States at that time, unfortunately. But Mussolini really did. He made the trains run on time, and he was not.
I think that's been a misquote. I think it's basically he made one train run on time once, and it sort of spiraled out of there.
I stand corrected. It's the image.
It's a bit
of
like
Mussolini.
Hitler getting accredited for the autobahns when it seems like those were planned before him anyway. But yeah,
Hitler didn't do the autobahn.
No.
Well, he built the autobahn.
I think it was sort of something that was going to be built and then got built in his time.
Well, I mean, Donald Trump talked about doing something about drug prices, but, it's Biden who did. Donald Trump talked about getting out of Afghanistan. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not saying, you got to give credit to Hitler or anything, but I'm just saying.
But you're also claiming Biden is Hitler in this analogy.
Sure. Don't put me in that box, Marie. Don't put me in that box. I've said very nice things about Joe Biden this episode.
You had to balance it out.
And I mean them. So where was I?
Talking about Mussolini.
Yes. So Mussolini, I think to some extent unfairly and as propaganda, but to some extent fairly Italy was not a country that was doing well, had a horrific time in World War I, and a lot of Mussolini's approaches to governing seemed attractive. And what's fascinating about Smedley Butler's career, even before retirement, such a strange episode I think you referred to earlier when the Philadelphia mayor asked the president to give him Smedley Butler, who was famous as a great Marine, to clean up Philadelphia. So this is before he went to China, before the end of his career with the Marine Corps. He spent a couple years as the police commissioner of of Philadelphia. I'm not sure. No, it was
Director of Public Safety.
That's it. Director of Public Safety, which is also a very revolutionary type terminology. The 1920s were a very different, very different time. And what's fascinating is if you look at Smedley Butler, who he was, a military figure, the way that he governed Philadelphia, he was strictly fair and strictly this, that, and the other thing, but just was very invasive, had sharp new uniforms for all the cops and set up checkpoints and did apparently succeed to some degree in...
Well, apparently he did so well, they hated him. He seemed to destroy a lot of speakeasies, because I think he became an alcoholic in, was it Philippine-American War? So because of that, he had dried up and was then very big into the temperance movement. So it was something he sort of personally believed in.
Yeah, he was a strong advocate of prohibition, which is... I think he ran for Senate at some point, and running for Senate on a platform of let's keep prohibition in the early 1930s, right before it was abolished, was not going to get him elected in Pennsylvania or anywhere else. I mean, maybe some. I think Oklahoma was dry until the 1950s or something strange like that. So maybe he could have done it in Oklahoma, but not Pennsylvania. But what's fascinating is you look at his career, the military man, the man on horseback, the guy who comes out, and his sort of launch into politics in the 1930s was the Bonus Army, which was a group of World War I veterans who marched on Washington during the Great Depression to insist on early payout of kind of pension that they had gotten from the U.S. government. I mean, that's, the March on Rome, I think, is the origin of Mussolini's time in power. And while Butler was not leading that, he went to the campments and sort of, don't do anything that would embarrass yourselves, but you're right, and you So he looked like, and allegedly, actually, I don't think anybody's alive to sue us anymore, so I'd say I believe this to be the case. In the 1930s, he was looked like so naturally a candidate to be a fascist leader that he was approached by a number of Wall Street figures. This remains immensely controversial. This is...
Sadly, a lot of the companies involved are still around.
Yes, indeed. JP Morgan.
So they might sue us.
Yeah. I think there's got to be a statute of limitation.
Yeah, there must be.
It would be a very strange choice, and good for the channel if JP Morgan were to choose to sue.
I think for a good couple of months until the case started, and then it would be very bad for the podcast.
Well, one never knows. One never knows how this.
Let's hope we never find out.
Well, but yeah. It's known as the business plot. This is the reason that Smedley Butler was played by Robert De Niro in a recent film called Amsterdam that I talked about at the beginning. The thing is, there's an incredible amount. The discussions of the business plot are fascinating because Smedley Butler, a guy I think his stability is often impugned, but nobody really complains about his honesty or integrity, claimed that certain Wall Street guy who claimed to be connected to JP Morgan and a range of other folks offered him money, showed him obscene amounts of money, like $50,000, which at that point was like, going around with a suitcase with $1 million or something. And asking him to come and speak at certain meetings and lead I think this was dramatized in the movie Amsterdam to some extent, and lead a march on Washington that would result in FDR being either made a meaningless figurehead or just being dispatched with entirely.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government and break down our democratic institutions. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government. I talked with an investigator for this committee who came to me with a subpoena on Sunday, November 18th. He told me they had unearthed evidence linking my name with several such veteran organizations. As it then seemed to me to be getting serious, I felt it was my duty to tell all I knew of such activities to this committee. My main interest in all this is to preserve our democratic institution. I want to retain the right to vote, the right to speak freely, and the right to write. If we maintain these basic principles, our democracy is safe. No dictatorship can exist with suffrage, freedom of speech, and press.
So it was a real attempt at a fascist coup in the United States. Smedley Butler made these claims, was interviewed by apparently a secret or a closed session of Congress that had nothing to say about it, and certainly no prosecutions, other than, yeah, we believe Smedley Butler. That sounds about right. That sounds like something that definitely happened, and yeah, that is definitely an attempted fascist coup in the United States. You've got the general, you've got the Congress, or at least these congressional committees being like, yeah, that totally happened. Yet for some reason, well, for obvious reasons that we just discussed, to this day, the business plot is described as a controversial or alleged thing. But it's very much a very real effing thing, even at the time and 90 years after. Folks are really reticent to talk about that.
And they describe it as a homegrown fascist movement. It's not influenced by Europe.
For sure.
Was Bush Sr.'s father involved?
Bush Sr.'s father would have been way too young. Bush Sr., but Prescott Bush, Bush Sr.'s father, you said. You're right. No, Prescott Bush. I haven't seen details around that, okay, but I wouldn't be shocked.
Because I think, weren't they a bit close with Nazi Germany?
Oh, I don't know
selling
about
aluminium
that.
And stuff?
I don't know about that. Was Prescott Bush selling aluminum? I just thought I'm not aware enough of Prescott Bush and his activities. I think that the thing about the Bush family is that they've been so rich for so long that like it's sort of Joe Kennedy and Henry Ford. It's the new money folks who were more likely to get wrapped up in embarrassing foreign stuff, whereas the Bushes were plutocrats who were like, well, I mean, I guess the Nazis are buying a lot of aluminium, but it seems like it could potentially be embarrassing. So we'll just focus on the rest of the world. I'm not even sure if they were in aluminum at that point. I know that their 20th century fortunes were based on political connections, getting some great oil leases. But I'm not entirely certain what Prescott Bush was up to. I think now that you mention it, I do vaguely recall some association between Prescott Bush and the business plot, but that's not. I haven't researched it to that degree.
Editing Rory here. Actually, Rob was totally wrong about this, and there is evidence that Prescott Bush was involved in business with the Nazis. His involvement in the business plot that Smedley Butler uncovered, however, has never been established.
But yeah, so this was a guy, this is a guy, military, had a lot of ways that he acted when he was in charge of Philadelphia that I find very uncomfortable as a civil libertarian. Yet when it came down to it, when folks were like, hey, let's Mussolini it up here, he was at root a good Pennsylvania Quaker who believed in the Constitution and was like, go F yourselves. And I truly, I think it's actually inaccurate to say that he's a heroic or admirable figure. I don't think he would describe himself that way because of the many, many crimes that he committed in his military career. But it's impossible to not admire the guy. It's fascinating figure, and retains credibility and usefulness to opponents of empire a century, 80 years after his death, because of the who he was and how much he was willing to speak out. So Smedley Butler, great American.
Potentially stopping a fascist coup, I think at least is one good mark.
Yes, that's a plus. That is definitely a plus. And it is interesting in reading about Wilson and FDR, the 1920s, the 1930s, is just how deeply fragile the United States was. As we'll talk about next episode, there's a lot of people like, oh, Roosevelt didn't do anything about the Great Depression. That was all just World War II, World War II spending in the Great Depression. Even assuming that's true, there were 8 years there where FDR managed to hold the country together, and in very real risk of a fascist coup that thankfully was not led by Smedley Butler.
And that's a lovely sneak peek at the next episode.
Indeed.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire, What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.